Paul Tremblay, one of my favorite working horror writers, because he has a signature, let's say. I first discovered his work with Head Full of Ghosts, and that one turned horror on its head for me. In that, I know a lot of people don't like ambiguity. However, Tremblay is known for his ambiguity, and that's one of the reasons I'm drawn to him. Because as we know, horror is about the unknown, right? It's about hypothesizing what might happen. It's not about giving every answer. But anyway, it's been some time since I've read a Tremblay book, so I thought, why not revisit him with his latest effort, Horror Movie? But before I begin with a review, what is the hook? What is Horror Movie about? In 1993, a group of teens make a film called Horror Movie that ended in tragedy. Since only 3 of the film's scenes were ever released publicly, 30 years later, modern Hollywood is willing to bite to remake the film. The only surviving member of the cast, known only by his character, the Thin Kid, is the one to sell. So what did I think? Well, first let me set the stage. This book is kind of a riff on the cursed film genre, something like The Ring. However, it's far more similar to the Blair Witch Project in that the cursed nature of the movie isn't affecting the viewers of the film, it's affecting the participants. So how do you convey this idea with the written word? Well, Tremblay is doing some very innovative, some very clever things in my opinion, which I will get into later. But first, I think we should start with character. The greatest thing about Tremblay's characterization is it's unassuming. It's subtle, it's quiet. It almost feels absent if you're not paying close attention because again, as you know with horror, it's important to tease all of this stuff out because that's what horror is. It's about building dread. It's about building tension until you have a hopefully satisfying ending. There are really 4 main characters in this story. Valentina, the mastermind behind the film. We have Cleo and we have Carson. But most importantly is the Thin Kid, or the man, the kid known as Thin Kid, because he's never named. He is the narrator of the book. And if you pay close attention, you can see his character develop over time. In the beginning, he feels kind of like a victim. He's timid and quiet. He's asked to be in this film. He's asked to play the Thin Kid, as I mentioned, and he's subjected to a lot of messed up stuff for the sake of art, you might say. And this is an effective way for us to empathize, to get behind him. And there's plenty of scenes in this book where you do feel bad for him. And the book is told in the past and present, labeled then and now. So you do get to see the Thin Kid as a teen, as well as an adult 30 years later. And as I mentioned, pay close attention because you will see some crossover through the timelines happening that further reinforce the development of the Thin Kid. So while the characterization is subtle, it blends beautifully into the plot of the novel. One might say a slow burn. Speaking of the other characters, Valentina, the mastermind, as I mentioned behind the film, the writer, the director, the creative mind. There's a great scene with her later in the book. Now, it's not when they're kids, it's when they're a little bit older and the Thin Kid went to go visit her later, well after the film had been completed. And I won't spoil anything, but you can see the toll that the film has brought upon her. It's a very calculated scene. It's very deliberately paced. It's very sad. It's very atmospheric, and it's one of the standout ones for me. And so while the characterization is thin outside of the Thin Kid, you'll see it more in small bursts with the other characters in the story, rather than really seeing their development over time. All right, let us move on to plot. Now, as I mentioned, the story is told in the past and the present, labeled then and now. In the chapter headings, we begin the book where the man known as the Thin Kid is meeting with a Hollywood producer trying to sell the remake of the film. So there are many chapters like that where he's meeting with potential directors, or even going to a horror convention. And while I found nostalgia in those scenes where he's meeting old horror actors and talking about all the cool scenes in movies that I grew up on, the scenes I looked forward to, or the chapters I looked forward to the most, were in the past, when we were experiencing how this film came to life. And this is where Tremblay excels, in pacing. He somehow manages to tease out the story without me getting bored for going on 300 pages. Well, let me qualify that. There were some chapters that were not as exciting as others. I didn't feel like they were building the tension or adding a lot of mystery compared to the word count that they were given, and those usually were the ones that were happening in the present. I would still say it's better than a lot of horror offerings I've read recently, because if you watch a lot of horror films or read a lot of horror novels, you know that there's generally kind of a hook scene at the very beginning that draws you in. There's some kind of creepy mystery going on, and then we have hundreds and hundreds of pages of day in the life, maybe with a sprinkling of mystery or horror here and there, that generally go on for far too long. But Tremblay, in my opinion, for the most part, succeeds in holding your interest throughout the entirety of the novel. He's able to give you little nuggets in every single chapter, even the ones that I found a little bit tiring. But structurally, it's a combination of modern day Thin Kid trying to get this film made in modern day Hollywood and learning about how the old film was made while they were teens, culminating into, in my opinion, a satisfying satisfying ending. So if you're familiar with Tremblay's endings, you'll know what I'm talking about, but he does something different. So if you've never read Tremblay before, he's very well known for his ambiguity. You'll get to the end of a horror novel and there'll be like a supernatural element throughout the course of the story, but then there also might be a logical reason embedded in reality as well. So by the time you get to the end, you're kind of wrestling with that in your mind. He doesn't always give you everything, but he gives you enough, in my opinion, to make it a satisfying conclusion. Because what is horror ultimately about? It's about fear. It's about evoking fear. And what is the strongest kind of fear, you might ask? Well, a man once said, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." So what happens when you have an ambiguous ending at the end of a horror novel? You have the unknown. You don't have a concrete conclusion. So the story lingers with you, at least hopefully if it's executed well. And to me, that is a hallmark of horror, and that is why I enjoy Tremblay's ending so much. And I don't know why I'm going into this in so much detail, because the ending's different. Yeah, he kind of breaks his rule. I was assuming something was going to happen and it didn't play out the way I thought. However, I really enjoyed the ending as it was presented because it's still ambiguous in a way. It is open-ended, and it's one of those endings that might cause you to continually look over your shoulder if you're walking in the darkness alone, perhaps. But what else in a novel aids in pacing? Well, that is the writing itself, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. So Tremblay is doing something interesting here, and I mentioned this at the very beginning of the review, and what that thing is he's using the script format, screenplay format inside the novel itself. And so the way he's doing it is at the very beginning of the chapter, and these sequences play out in the past when we're learning about the kids and how they made the film. It starts off in prose, first-person POV, and then slowly it will blend into this script format. So what does that do? It does two things, as I mentioned. The first thing is it speeds up the pacing. So you'll know when you're reading standard prose, it takes longer. And the funny thing is in this novel is there's very long paragraphs a lot of the time, in the first-person part anyway. And this further keyed me in on this observation I'm going to make right now, in that you have dense text and then you have sparse text with the script. And so it's almost like you're wearing a weighted vest, trudging through the text in the beginning, and then you drop that vest and you feel like if you ran, you might fly away. And so compositionally, it speeds up the pace. It changes the pace of the entire chapter. But also, the script form is telling us about the past and how the film was made, but it also feels like it's blending into the movie itself. And so you're constantly second guessing yourself. What's real? What's not real? And that's where the ambiguity comes in. Paul Tremblay's signature. And so to me, this was by far the most standout part of the writing itself. It wasn't only a shift in the content, it was a shift in the construction. And what does this do? It adds another level of cinematography to the writing, which is why I'm going to give Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay a 7.5 out of 10. A horror novel that manages to build tension and dread without losing its effectiveness, with subtle characterization to tease out the development in parallel with the story, and writing that adopts a shift in composition which aids not only in the immersive experience but the pacing itself. But that is it for the review. Let me know if you've read Horror Movie, what you thought of it. Did you like it? Did you not like it? As well as if you've read any of other Tremblay's works, I'd love to hear it. And if you would like to check out my own creative work, my own novels, you can see the link down in the description below. Thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.